The wind was the only priest. It howled a low, mournful sermon across the plains, tearing at the loose dirt Ilara shoveled onto the raw wooden box. Each scrape of the spade against the pile of earth was a final, terrible sound, a punctuation mark at the end of her husband's life. The soil was stubborn and dry, filled with rocks that clattered into the grave like scattered teeth. It was a poor substitute for a blessing, but it was all she had. Thomas was in that box. The thought was simple, stark, and impossible. Just a week ago, he had been a man of substance, his hands calloused from the plow, his laughter a warm rumble that filled their small cabin. Now he was just a memory, a weight in the ground she was tasked with covering. The stampede had been a freak occurrence. The sheriff had said, a bolt of lightning, a spooked led steer. But Ilara had seen the tracks of shod horses where they should not have been, near the ravine where the cattle had been driven to their doom. She knew it was no accident, but her knowing was a feather against the weight of Silas Blackwood's influence in this territory. And so she dug, her silence a shield against a grief so vast it threatened to swallow her whole. Her 3 children stood a little ways off, small, forlorn figures against the immense, indifferent sky. Samuel, at 10, held his shoulders stiffly, his jaw set in a poor imitation of his father's stoicism. He was trying so hard to be the man of the house, his knuckles white where he gripped a uselessly small pebble. He refused to cry, seeing tears as a betrayal of the new role thrust upon him. Clara, 7, was a shadow at his side. She watched everything with eyes that seemed too old for her small face, her thumb tucked firmly in her mouth. She did not look at the grave, but at her mother, her gaze a silent, constant question. And then there was Lily, at 4. She understood only the cold and the sadness. She clung to Clara's skirt, her small face buried in the worn calico, a tiny whimper escaping her lips now and then, lost immediately to the uncaring wind. When the last spadeful of dirt was patted down, Ilara's work was not done. It had only just begun. Grief was a luxury for women with family to lean on, with money in a jar, with a future that was not a terrifying, blank horizon. Ilara had none of these. She had the farm, the bone-wearying work, and 3 small mouths to feed. The days that followed blurred into a grueling rhythm of survival. She woke before the sun, her body aching with a weariness that had settled deep into her bones, and forced herself into the chill morning air. She milked their lone cow, her hands chapped and clumsy on the teats Thomas had handled with such ease. She collected eggs, mended the fence where a coyote had been testing the wire, and chopped wood until her shoulders screamed in protest. The sun beat down on her, sweat stinging her eyes and tracing paths through the grime on her face. Samuel tried to help, his small frame straining to lift things too heavy for him, his face a mask of fierce concentration. He would not admit defeat, not even when a log slipped and gashed his shin, a wound he bore with a silent grimace. Ilara cleaned it and wrapped it, her touch gentle but her heart a cold knot of fear. What if he was truly hurt? There was no doctor for miles, and no money to pay him if there were. Inside the cabin, the silence was the loudest sound. The space, once filled with Thomas's presence, now felt hollow, haunted by his absence. Every creak of the floorboards was a ghost. She would cook their meager meals, stretching the dwindling supply of flour and beans, her mind a frantic ledger of what they had and what they needed. The nights were the worst. After the children were asleep, curled together on their straw mattress for warmth and comfort, Ilara would lie awake on her own empty bed, the terror crawling up from her belly. The darkness pressed in, filled with the sounds of the wilderness and the gnawing fear for her children's future. She would clench her fists against the scream building in her throat, her tears hot and silent in the suffocating dark. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. It was on a blistering afternoon 2 weeks after the burial that a rider appeared on the horizon. He was not a welcome sight. Silas Blackwood sat atop his fine black stallion as if it were a throne, his suit dark and immaculate despite the dust, his face a mask of practiced solemnity. He was the town's banker, a man whose wealth and influence were woven into the very fabric of redemption. He owned the general store, held the loans on half the farms in the county, and had the sheriff's ear. He dismounted and swept his hat from his head, his silvering hair glinting in the sun. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice a smooth, oily condolence. "A terrible tragedy, a great loss to the community. Thomas was a fine man." Ilara stood on her porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her body rigid. She did not trust his sympathy. She had seen the way he looked at their land, at their small herd, his eyes calculating and cold. "Mr. Blackwood," she managed, her voice flat. Samuel came to stand beside her, his small hand protectively on her arm, his eyes narrowed with a boy's instant distrust. "I have come on an unfortunate matter of business," Blackwood continued, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "As you know, I try to help the folk in this territory. I extended a loan to Thomas some time ago, for seed and equipment. He was a proud man, not one to speak of his troubles." He unfolded the paper. It was a deed, filled with dense, legal script. His finger, clean and manicured, pointed to a line at the bottom. Thomas's signature was there, unmistakable. And beside it, the collateral for the loan, the farm, the full 160 acres. Ilara's blood ran cold. "He never told me." "As I said, a proud man," Blackwood purred, the feigned sympathy dripping from his words. "The loan is past due. I am afraid. The stampede, your lost cattle, it has made the debt impossible to repay. The bank must regrettably take possession of the property." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. "Take possession? This is our home. We have nowhere else to go." "The law is the law, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice losing its sympathetic edge, replaced by a cool finality. He was no longer a neighbor offering condolences. He was a vulture claiming his carrion. "I will be charitable. You have until sundown tomorrow to vacate the premises." He did not wait for a reply. He mounted his horse, gave a curt, dismissive nod, and rode away, leaving them standing in a cloud of dust and shattered hopes. The paper felt heavy and damning in Ilara's hand. He had ripped away her last shred of security, her last tie to the life she had built with Thomas. They were destitute. The next day passed in a haze of panicked despair. They packed what little they could into a single, rickety handcart. A few blankets, a cast-iron pot, their worn clothes, and the family Bible. Ilara looked around the small cabin one last time. At the table Thomas had built, the chair he always sat in, the faint indentation of his head still on his pillow. Every object was a fresh stab of pain. She herded her children out the door, refusing to let them see her cry, and pulled the door shut on her life. The town of Redemption offered no redemption at all. It was a single, dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place where piety was a weapon and judgment was the common currency. As Ilara led her children down the main street, pulling the heavy cart, doors closed. Women who had shared coffee with her just a month before now turned their heads, busying themselves with sweeping their porches or shaking out rugs. Men tipped their hats with a cold, perfunctory air, their eyes sliding past her as if she were invisible. The whispers followed them like flies. A burden, a failure. Thomas must have been a poor manager. They murmured, for his family to be turned out so. No one offered a hand, a room, a meal. They were pariahs, marked by the double stain of grief and poverty. Her last hope was the church. She found Reverend Michael tending his small garden beside the white-painted building. He listened to her plight, his face a mask of pious concern, his fingers plucking weeds from around his rose bushes. "A terrible trial. Sister Ilara," he said when she had finished, his voice smooth and practiced. "The Lord tests us in mysterious ways. We must have faith." "Faith will not feed my children, Reverend," Ilara said, her voice raw. "We need shelter, just for a few nights. until I can find work." The Reverend sighed, wiping his hands on a cloth. "The town has its own burdens. We cannot take on every stray. Perhaps you should have been more prudent. A woman alone is in a precarious position." He looked at her, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "There is little I can do." It was then that Silas Blackwood appeared, as if summoned. He walked toward them, his boots silent in the thick dust. Several townsfolk, sensing a spectacle, began to drift closer. "Reverend," Blackwood said, his voice carrying across the street, "it seems our poor Mrs. Miller is in a predicament." He turned to Alara, his face a perfect picture of magnanimous concern. "My dear woman, it pains me to see you and these beautiful children in such a state." He held up a hand to the gathering crowd. "Friends, neighbors, we are a Christian community. We cannot turn our backs on a widow in her time of need." A murmur of agreement went through the small crowd, but it was hesitant, uncertain. They all knew their fortunes were in some way tied to the man speaking. "I have given the matter considerable thought," Blackwood announced, his voice booming with false charity. "There is not a family in redemption with room to spare, nor work for a woman unaccustomed to it. But we cannot let her and her children perish in the wilderness." He paused for dramatic effect, letting his gaze sweep over the faces of the onlookers. "There is one man on the edge of this territory who lives alone, a man with a roof and no family of his own to burden him. He keeps to himself, but perhaps his heart is not as hard as folks say." Alara felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She knew who he meant. Everyone knew. "I speak, of course, of Jedediah," Blackwood proclaimed. The name fell like a stone into the quiet street. There were gasps, shocked whispers. Jedediah was the town outcast, a recluse who lived miles out in the rough country. A man whispered to be half wild, touched by a sorrow so deep it had driven him from the company of men. He never came to town unless it was absolutely necessary, and when he did, he spoke to no one, his eyes haunted and distant. The insinuation was thick and poisonous. Blackwood was not offering a solution. He was delivering a final, public humiliation. He was suggesting she, a grieving widow, seek shelter with a man of ill repute, a savage. He was branding her as desperate and fallen, a woman who would go to any man for a roof over her head. He was shaming her, and in the same breath, he was prodding the beast that was Jedediah, a man known for his volatile temper in the face of provocation. Ilara's face burned with shame. The eyes of the townspeople were on her, a mixture of pity, scorn, and morbid curiosity. She looked at Samuel's pale, furious face, at Clara's terrified eyes, at Lily, who had started to cry softly. She had no choice. To refuse would be to choose starvation in the wilderness for her children. Blackwood had backed her into a corner, leaving her only one path, the most wretched one he could devise. With a numb, mechanical motion, she gripped the handle of the handcart. Without a word, she turned her back on the silent, watching town and began to walk west, out onto the open prairie. The long, perilous journey to Jedediah's homestead had begun. The sun was a merciless hammer. The wheels of the cart sank into the soft dirt, making every foot of progress an agonizing effort. Lily was too small to walk for long, so Ilara had to lift her onto the cart. Adding to the weight, the landscape was vast and brutal, a canvas of cracked earth, thorny brush, and the shimmering, hazy heat that rose from the ground. They finished their water by midday. Thirst became a living thing, a rasp in their throats, a fire in their bellies. By late afternoon, the children were stumbling, their faces streaked with tears and dust. Ilara's own strength was failing, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. The hope she had clung to had withered and died, leaving only a grim, desperate resolve to take one more step, and then one more. The narrative shifted, the wind carrying it miles away to a small, sturdy cabin nestled in a shallow canyon, a lone sentinel against the wilderness. Inside, Jedediah moved with a heavy, practiced economy. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and weathered, his face a map of sun and sorrow. His hands, though calloused and scarred, were surprisingly gentle as he stitched a tear in a leather harness. The cabin was sparse but orderly, everything in its place. A rifle rested above the stone hearth. A bedroll was tucked neatly in a corner. A single plate and cup were clean on the rough-hewn table. It was the space of a man who lived a life stripped down to its barest essentials, a life of disciplined solitude. But the solitude was not peaceful. As he worked, a ghost walked the room with him. A brief, searing memory flickered behind his eyes, as vivid as if it were yesterday. The scent of sickness, the shallow, ragged breathing of his wife, Sarah, her face pale with fever, and his boy, his little Ben, his small body burning up, his cries growing weaker and weaker. Jedediah saw his own hands, large and useless, unable to stop the relentless march of the fever that claimed them both within a week of each other. He had been powerless then, a giant of a man rendered impotent by an enemy he could not fight. The grief had hollowed him out, leaving behind a quiet, aching emptiness that the years had not filled. He had built this cabin with his own hands, seeking a solitude that matched the desolation in his soul. A sharp bark from his dog, tethered outside, pulled him from the memory. He rose and went to the door, his eyes scanning the terrain. What he saw made him freeze. A woman, pulling a handcart with a small child riding on it, and two other children stumbling behind her. They were a portrait of utter desperation, moving with the slow, agonizing gait of the nearly defeated. He watched them approach, his face an unreadable mask, his hand resting on the doorframe. Elara saw the cabin first, then the man. He was even more imposing than the story suggested, a silent, bearded figure standing in the doorway of his home like a bear guarding its den. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it. The end of the line. She brought the cart to a halt a few yards from him, the children huddling behind her. She forced herself to meet his gaze. His eyes were a startling gray, and in their depths, she saw not wildness, but a profound and terrible sadness. Her own fear seemed to ebb, replaced by a strange sense of kinship with this broken man. "Mr. Jedediah," she began, her voice trembling but resolute. "My name is Elara Miller. My husband. He passed. The bank took our farm. The town." Her voice broke. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "Silas Blackwood sent us. He said you were the only one who might help." She stood before him, stripped of everything but her dignity, fully expecting him to cast her and her children back into the wilderness to die. Before Jedediah could answer, the sound of hoofbeats and crude laughter echoed down the canyon. 3 riders, men Elara recognized as hands from one of Blackwood's ranches, pulled up their horses a short distance away. "Well, looky here," one of them shouted, a cruel smirk on his face. "Blackwood was right. The widow went straight to the wild man's den. Found yourself a new woman already. Jedediah?" Another laughed. "Be careful she don't try to civilize you." The taunts hung in the air, thick and ugly. Jedediah's gaze shifted from Elara's desperate face to the 3 shivering children huddled behind her skirts. He saw Samuel's futile attempt at bravery, Clara's wide, terrified eyes, and little Lily, so small and fragile. And in them, he saw the ghosts of his own lost family. He saw Sarah's quiet strength in Elara's face. He saw his Ben in the defiant set of Samuel's jaw. The cold, dead grief that had been his constant companion for years suddenly ignited, transforming into a white-hot, protective fury. The emptiness inside him was filled with a purpose so fierce it made him tremble. He took a slow step forward, planting himself directly in front of Elara and her children, a human shield between them and the hostile world. He looked at the riders, and the deadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a look of such cold, deadly intent that the men's smirks faltered. The air crackled with a sudden, palpable danger. His voice, when it came, was not a shout. It was a low, steady whisper that carried with the weight of an unbreakable oath, a sound that cut through the wind and the jeers with absolute finality. "She's my family now." The riders stared, their bravado evaporating in the face of this quiet, transformed man. They exchanged uneasy glances. Then, without another word, they wheeled their horses around and galloped away. Jedediah watched them go, his body still tense. Then, he turned. He looked at the stunned, disbelieving face of the widow and the 3 exhausted children. He did not smile, but the harsh lines of his face softened almost imperceptibly. He simply nodded toward the open cabin door. "Come inside," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You are safe here." He ushered the stunned family into the warm, dim interior of his home, closing the heavy wooden door and sliding the bolt into place. The sound echoed in the small space, a final, definitive click that shut out the cruelty, the judgment, and the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The silence in Jedediah's cabin was a different kind from the one Alara had known in her own empty home. Her silence had been a hollow vessel for grief and fear. This silence was dense, solid, and watchful. It was the silence of a man long accustomed to being alone, a silence that seemed to have weight and substance. In the first few days, the small cabin felt dangerously crowded, not by their physical bodies, but by the sheer, jarring presence of 4 new souls in a space built for one. Jedediah moved through his home with the quiet deliberation of a creature in its den, and they were the interlopers. The children, sensing the fragility of their welcome, were unnaturally quiet. Clara seemed to shrink into herself, her eyes following the large, bearded man from the perceived safety of her mother's skirts. Samuel, chafing under the inactivity and the feeling of being a charity case, was wound as tight as a spring, his hands constantly clenching and unclenching at his sides. Even little Lily's babble was hushed, her usual bright energy dimmed by the strange, somber atmosphere. For Alara, every waking moment was a balancing act between a profound, overwhelming gratitude and a deep, instinctual wariness. This man had saved them. He had faced down Blackwood's thugs and offered them his roof when the entire world had turned its back. That act was a debt she could never repay, but he was also a stranger, a man with a sorrow so deep it radiated from him like cold from a block of ice. His silence was a wall she did not know how to breach, and she found herself watching his every move, trying to understand the man who had, with 5 quiet words, claimed them. Jedediah, for his part, seemed to be navigating a landscape as foreign as they were. The sudden eruption of life in his ordered solitude was a constant shock to his system. A child's cough in the night, the soft thud of a dropped toy, the scent of Alara's hair as she passed him in the narrow space by the hearth. They were intrusions into a world he had carefully, painfully, scrubbed clean of such things. Yet, he made space for them. Without a word on the first night, he had taken the blankets from his own bed, a sturdy frame in the corner, and laid them out for Alara and the girls. He took for himself a simple bedroll by the fire, seating the warmest, safest part of the cabin. The gesture was unspoken, but it was not missed. It was the first plank in a fragile bridge being built between them. His kindness emerged in small, gruff, practical ways, never accompanied by a soft word or a smile. He noticed Samuel watching him one morning as he split firewood. The boy's eyes filled with a desperate need to be useful. Jedediah stopped, hefted the axe, and held it out. "You are holding it too low," he said, his voice a rough baritone. "You will tire yourself out, and the wood will not split clean." He spent the next hour showing the boy the proper stance, the right way to bring the weight of the axe down, the precise point to aim for. He corrected Samuel's grip, adjusted his swing, and when the boy finally split a log cleanly in 2, Jedediah gave a single, curt nod of approval that made Samuel's chest swell with more pride than 100 words of praise could have. He found Clara one afternoon sitting on the floor, her face a mask of quiet tragedy as she cradled her worn-out rag doll. Its arm, attached by a few frayed threads, had finally given way. Jedediah watched her for a long moment before going to a small wooden chest. He returned with a needle and a spool of thick, waxed thread, the kind he used for mending leather. He sat on the floor, a giant of a man, cross-legged before the tiny, silent girl, and held out his hand for the doll. Clara hesitated, then placed it gently in his palm. His large, calloused fingers, surprisingly nimble, stitched the arm back into place with small, strong stitches. He tied off the knot, bit the thread, and handed it back to her. Clara looked from the mended doll to his face, her own eyes wide with a silent, wondering gratitude. For Lily, who was too young to understand pride or subtlety, his kindness was even simpler. He would return from checking his trap lines and, without a word, leave a strip of smoked jerky or a handful of wild berries on the table where she could reach them. They were offerings, plain and simple, gestures that said, "You are hungry, here is food." Ilara refused to let them be burdens. Her pride, though battered, was not broken. She repaid his sanctuary with work. From the second day, she imposed a quiet order on his bachelor's existence. She found his meager supplies and cooked meals that, while simple, were nourishing and warm. She scrubbed the rough wooden floors, washed his few shirts until they were clean, and mended the tear in his canvas coat. She rose before him, stoking the fire so the cabin was warm when he woke, and she banked the embers long after he had settled into his bedroll. Her constant, quiet industry was a language he understood. She was not asking for charity, she was earning her keep. They worked around each other in a silent, efficient rhythm, two solitary people learning the complex dance of a shared life. And in her tireless resilience, her refusal to be broken, he saw a strength that earned his unspoken respect. But beneath the surface of this new, fragile domesticity, their private worlds remained places of torment. Ilara's nights were filled with jagged, terrifying dreams. She would see the churning hooves of the cattle, hear the sickening crack of bone, and wake with Thomas's name a strangled cry on her lips, her body slick with a cold sweat. During the day, the fear was a constant, low hum beneath her thoughts. She would find herself staring out the cabin's single window, her stomach clenching at the sight of any distant rider. Terrified it was Blackwood, coming to finish what he had started. He had threatened to have her children taken from her, to have them declared wards of the state and sent to some dreadful orphanage. The thought was a physical pain, a terror so profound it threatened to paralyze her. Her children were all she had left of her life, her only reason to keep fighting. Jedediah, too, was haunted. The sight of the children was a constant, aching reminder of what he had lost. When he watched Samuel trying to master the axe, he saw his own son, Ben, who had always tried to imitate him, his small face screwed up in concentration. When Clara sat quietly by the fire, her solemn eyes reflecting the flames, he remembered how his Ben would sit just so, listening to a story, and Lily's innocent laughter, on the rare occasions it bubbled up, was the cruelest echo of all. It was a sound he had thought was gone from his life forever. He had failed to save his own boy. The memory of his powerlessness, of the fever he could not fight, was a wound that had never healed. Now, these children were under his roof, a living testament to his past failure, and the weight of protecting them felt immense, terrifying. Autumn bled into winter with a sudden, brutal swiftness. The sky turned a slate gray, and a bitter wind began to howl down from the mountains, rattling the cabin and stripping the last leaves from the cottonwood trees. One evening, the first snowflakes began to fall, thick and heavy. By morning, the world outside was a swirling vortex of white, the snow piling up in deep drifts against the cabin walls. A brutal early winter storm had descended, trapping them. For over a week, the world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the forced proximity, The relentless howling of the wind and the lack of work to distract them began to wear away at their reserves. The silence, once just awkward, became heavy, oppressive. It was Samuel who broke it first, asking Jedediah about a peculiar knot in the wood of the ceiling beam. The question led to Jedediah explaining the different types of wood, which led to a story about a particular pine tree he had felled years ago. Hesitantly, Elara began to share as well. She spoke of her childhood on a farm in Ohio, of the sprawling apple orchards and the way the seasons turned. They were simple stories, memories of a life before hardship had scoured it clean. They spoke not of their deep traumas, of the spouses they had lost or the pain that defined them, but of small, ordinary things. A favorite horse, a county fair, the taste of a mother's pie, in the warm, fire-lit bubble of the cabin. Surrounded by the raging storm, they offered each other these small pieces of their pasts, and the fragile bridge between them grew stronger. It was on the 5th day of their confinement that a new and terrible fear entered the cabin. Little Lily, who had been listless and pale all day, began to shiver uncontrollably. By evening, her skin was hot to the touch, her cheeks flushed with a dangerous, blotchy red. She had a high fever. Elara was thrown into a raw, consuming panic. She saw Thomas's face in her mind, pale and sweating in the grip of the pneumonia that had weakened him in the days before the stampede. The memory was fresh, visceral. She felt the same icy dread she had felt then, the same sickening helplessness. Sickness was a swift and merciless thief in this unforgiving land. She pressed a cool, damp cloth to Lily's forehead. But the child only whimpered, her small body trembling. Elara's hands shook, her mind screaming, "Not again, please, not again, not one of my children." Jedediah, who had been watching from the hearth, was jolted from his own dark memories. He saw not Lily, but Ben, his own son, his small body burning with the fever he had been powerless to stop. The same scent of sickness filled the air, the same shallow, rattling breaths. For a moment, the old, suffocating helplessness threatened to drown him. But then, something shifted. This was not the past. This was now. This was not his son, but a little girl under his protection, and this time, he was not helpless. The years of solitude had not been entirely empty. He had learned the land, learned its secrets, its remedies. He rose, his movements suddenly filled with a gentle, focused competence. "Keep the cloth on her head," he said to Elara, his voice calm and steady, cutting through her rising panic. "And try to get her to drink some water, just a spoonful at a time." He pulled on his heavy coat and boots, took a small shovel from beside the door, and disappeared into the swirling blizzard. Elara stared after him, her fear warring with a flicker of confusion. He returned 20 minutes later, covered in snow, his beard frosted with ice. In his hands, he carried a bundle of dark, gnarled roots. He worked at the hearth, cleaning the roots and crushing them with the handle of his knife. He brewed them in a small pot of water, filling the cabin with a sharp, earthy scent. He strained the liquid into a cup. "Willow bark," he explained, his voice low. "It will help with the fever. And this," he added, holding up a few dried leaves, "is yarrow, to make her sweat." He knelt beside the bed where Lily lay tossing and turning. He gently lifted her head and, with a patience that astonished Elara, coaxed a few spoonfuls of the bitter tea between her lips. For the rest of the night, he did not leave her side. He sat on a low stool, a silent, unmovable guardian. He bathed her forehead, spoke to her in a low, soothing murmur, and every hour, he made her drink more of the tea. Elara watched him from a chair across the room, her own fear held at bay by his quiet, steady presence. She saw past the gruff, silent outcast the world thought him to be. She saw a man whose own deep wounds had not destroyed his capacity for gentleness. She saw the pain in his eyes as he looked at her sick child, and she understood. With a sudden, piercing clarity, that he was not just tending to Lily, he was fighting the ghosts of his own past. In the dim, flickering firelight, the intimidating stranger was transformed into a deeply caring and wounded man. Sometime before dawn, a change occurred. Lily's shivering stopped, and a light sheen of sweat broke out on her forehead. Her breathing, though still shallow, became more regular. Jedediah placed a hand on her brow, his touch surprisingly gentle. He looked over at Alara, his gray eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "The fever is breaking," he whispered. The relief that washed over Alara was so immense it was like a physical wave, leaving her weak and trembling. The tears she had been holding back for days finally came, silent and hot, tracking paths down her face. Lily was going to be all right. He had saved her. Jedediah rose and came over to her, his large frame blocking the firelight. He stood before her, looking down, a question in his eyes. Without thinking, overwhelmed by a flood of profound gratitude and a nascent, stirring emotion she could not yet name, Alara reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, but he did not pull away. The simple gesture hung in the air, charged with unspoken meaning. It was not the touch of a woman in need, but the touch of an equal, a silent acknowledgement of the battle he had just fought for her child, for all of them. It was the first true bond of trust forged between them, a connection as real and as strong as the sturdy walls of the cabin that sheltered them from the storm. A few days later, the storm passed, leaving the world outside buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. But the news of their confinement had already traveled. A lone rider, seeking shelter and redemption, had mentioned seeing the widow Miller's handcart outside the recluse's cabin just before the storm hit. That single observation was all Silas Blackwood needed. He fanned the spark of gossip into a raging fire. In the warmth of the Redemption General Store, the story was twisted into something ugly and vicious. Alara was no longer a desperate widow seeking shelter, but a fallen woman who had immediately taken up with a half-wild man. Jedediah was not her savior, but her keeper, a savage who had taken advantage of her plight. The pious women of the town clucked their tongues, their judgment swift and merciless. The men told crude jokes, their laughter echoing the taunts of Blackwood's riders. Their status as outcasts was now cemented, their names bound together in scandal, hardening the town's prejudice against them into a wall of cold, unshakable contempt. They were utterly alone now, an island in a sea of scorn, with only each other to rely on. The spring thaw came not as a gentle melt, but as a great, cracking release. The ice on the creek shattered with a sound like cannon fire, and the water, swollen with melted snow, roared through the canyon. The oppressive, claustrophobic atmosphere that had settled in the cabin during the long storm broke with it. Sunlight, pale and thin at first, then stronger and warmer each day, spilled across the rough wooden floor. It was a time of awakening, for the land and for the souls within the small homestead. They moved outside, into the clean, cold air, their movements no longer constrained by four walls. They worked. It was a shared, unspoken creed between them. Work was the answer to grief, the antidote to fear, the currency of survival. Jedediah and Alara fell into a rhythm dictated by the needs of the land and the turning of the sun. They worked side by side, a silent, efficient team. Together, they repaired the section of the corral fence that had been weakened by the heavy snow. Alara would hold the new post steady, her small hands firm on the rough wood, while Jedediah drove it into the soft earth with powerful, measured blows from a heavy mallet. The rhythmic thud was the only sound between them, a percussive beat to their shared labor. Sometimes, as he reached for a tool or a length of wire, the back of his hand would brush against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through Alara, a sudden warmth that had nothing to do with the strengthening sun. She would pull her hand back, her heart giving a strange little flutter, and pretend not to notice the way Jedediah's movements would falter for just a second. They turned over a patch of earth near the cabin, preparing it for a garden. Jedediah broke the stubborn, rocky soil with a heavy spade, his back and shoulders straining with the effort, while Elara followed behind, breaking up the clods of dirt and pulling out the persistent, stringy roots of weeds. She showed him which plants from her own garden had been the hardiest, and he, in turn, showed her which wild herbs growing near the creek could be used for cooking or for medicine. He taught the children, too. He showed Samuel how to read the tracks of deer and rabbits, his voice low and patient. He pointed out the difference between a hawk and an eagle to a watchful Clara. He became their teacher, their protector, and the quiet, solid center of their new world. A comfortable domesticity settled over them. The silence between them was no longer the tense, watchful quiet of strangers. It was a companionable silence, born of a shared understanding that needed no words. They knew the rhythm of each other's breathing, the sound of each other's footsteps. They could communicate with a glance, a nod, a simple gesture. The cabin, once a stranger's intimidating den, now felt like a home. It was small, and it was crowded, but it was theirs. With this new comfort came something else, something unspoken and potent that shimmered in the air between them. The wall of grief and caution that had separated Jedediah and Elara began to crumble, eroded by shared work and quiet companionship. Desire, long buried in both of them, began to stir. It manifested in small, charged moments that were as powerful as a shout in the quiet of their lives. It was in a shared glance over the dinner table, their eyes meeting over the flickering candle flame. The look would last a second too long, a silent question passing between them before Elara would drop her gaze to her plate, a warm blush creeping up her neck. It was in the way Jedediah would watch her, his work forgotten for a moment, as she hung their laundry on the line he had strung between two trees. The wind would press the thin fabric of her dress against her body, outlining the soft curves of her hips and bust, and a deep, possessive ache would tighten in his chest. He was watching her not as a burden or a responsibility, but as a woman, and the realization was a profound and unsettling thing. It was in the sound of his name on her lips. She no longer called him Mr. Jedediah. He was just Jedediah now, and when she said his name, it was with a soft, quiet intimacy that made it sound like a secret, a caress. These moments were fleeting, but they left a lingering tension in the air, a humming awareness of the man and woman they were beneath the weight of the roles they had been forced to play. Their world, for a brief, hopeful season, was this small, isolated patch of land. But the world outside had not forgotten them, and their dwindling supplies were a constant, nagging reminder. The flour sack was nearly empty. The salt was running low, and they needed seeds for the garden if it was to feed them through the next winter. A trip to redemption was unavoidable. The journey was fraught with a tension that was absent from their first desperate trek. Then, they had been fleeing toward an unknown fate. Now, they were leaving a sanctuary to face a known evil. Jedediah drove a small buckboard wagon pulled by a sturdy mule. Elara sat beside him on the hard wooden seat, the children in the back. No one spoke. The familiar, beautiful landscape now seemed menacing, the silence of the plains filled with a sense of foreboding. Redemption had not changed. It was still a town choked by dust and judgment, but their reception was different. Before, they had been met with a cold, pitying scorn. Now, they were met with open hostility. As they walked down the main street toward the general store, a silence fell. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. The looks they received were hard, accusing. Women pulled their children back as Elara passed, as if she were a carrier of some virulent disease. The whispers were no longer hidden behind cupped hands. They were audible, sharp and cruel. "There she is, living in sin with that wild man. Shameless." Elara kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her face a pale, proud mask, but she could feel the heat of the stares, the sting of the words. She felt Samuel tense beside her, his small fists clenched, and she put a calming hand on his shoulder. The hostility came to a head inside Miller's General Store. The owner, a portly, self-righteous man named Mr. Gable, was standing behind the counter. He watched them enter, his face sour with disapproval. Elara approached the counter with her short list, her voice quiet but clear as she asked for flour, salt, and beans. Mr. Gable folded his arms across his chest. "I do not have any goods for you," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. Elara blinked, confused. "I have money. I can pay." "Your money is not the issue," Gable sneered, his eyes flicking from her to Jedediah, who stood silently by the door. "This is a respectable establishment. We do not serve your kind here. A woman who abandons her grieving for the company of him." He gestured dismissively toward Jedediah. "It is a disgrace to your dead husband's memory." The public humiliation was a slap in the face. The blood drained from Elara's cheeks, and she stood frozen, the eyes of the other customers burning into her. Shame, hot and suffocating, threatened to overwhelm her. Then, Jedediah moved. He took 3 slow, deliberate steps and placed himself in front of her, his body a solid shield between Elara and the store owner. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He simply looked at Mr. Gable, his gray eyes as cold and flat as river stones in winter. There was no anger in his gaze, but something far more terrifying. A quiet, absolute promise of violence. His very stillness was a threat. The air in the store grew thick, heavy with a menace that was more potent than any shout. Mr. Gable's blustering confidence evaporated under that silent, level gaze. A sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. He swallowed, his jowls trembling slightly. He looked away from Jedediah, unable to meet his eyes. "Just get what you need and go," Gable mumbled, his voice suddenly weak and thin. Jedediah did not move until Elara had gathered her supplies. He paid for them with a few coins he placed deliberately on the counter, his eyes never leaving the store owner's face. Then, he took the heavy sack from Elara and guided her and the children out of the store. He had defended her, in front of the entire town. He had claimed her as his own to protect, and in that moment, their silent partnership was forged into something solid, unbreakable. Their victory was short-lived. As they were loading their supplies into the buckboard, a familiar, chilling voice cut through the air. "Well, well, the happy couple comes to town." Silas Blackwood stood on the boardwalk across the street, a cruel, mocking smile on his face. 2 of his hired men flanked him. Jedediah turned slowly, placing himself once again between Elara and the threat. "Blackwood," he said, his voice a low rumble. Blackwood's smile widened. "I see you are playing house. Jedediah, it is almost touching, but you must understand that the good people of this town are concerned. A grieving widow, a woman of delicate sensibilities, living in the wilderness with a man like you." He clucked his tongue in mock sympathy. "And the children. We must think of the children." Elara's heart stopped. "The town council is considering a petition," Blackwood continued, his voice dripping with venomous sincerity, "to have the children removed from your unfit care. They would be better off in a proper Christian orphanage, where they can be raised with some sense of decency." The threat struck Elara with the force of a physical blow. It was her deepest, most primal fear-given voice. She let out a small, involuntary gasp and reached back, her hands finding Samuel and Clara, pulling them tight against her. To lose her children would be to lose everything. It would be a death from which she would not recover. Jedediah saw the sheer terror in her eyes. A low, dangerous sound growled in his chest. "You will not touch them," he said, each word a block of ice. Blackwood just laughed. A cold, empty sound. "We will see," he said, before turning and walking away, his men following like shadows. The ride back to the homestead was silent and heavy with dread. Blackwood's threat had poisoned the air, turning their small sanctuary into a place of desperate vulnerability. The peace they had found was shattered. They were a few hundred yards from the cabin when it happened. A small herd of horses, belonging to a neighboring ranch, was grazing peacefully on a nearby hill. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked the air from a distant ridge, followed by a second. The horses, terrified, bolted. They stampeded directly toward the wagon path, a churning, chaotic mass of panicked flesh and thundering hooves. Jedediah reacted instantly, pulling hard on the reins, trying to turn the mule out of their path. "Stay in the wagon," he yelled. But Samuel, his face pale with a mixture of fear and a desperate desire to prove his bravery, did the exact opposite. He saw one of the lead horses veering straight for them. "I can turn him!" he shouted, and before Elara could grab him, he leaped from the back of the moving wagon. He landed awkwardly, stumbled, and fell directly into the path of the stampede. It was a moment of pure, sickening terror. Elara screamed, a raw, ragged sound torn from the depths of her soul. Jedediah roared Samuel's name, his face a mask of horror. The world dissolved into a blur of dust and hooves, and a small boy's terrified cry. A large bay horse, its eyes wide with panic, could not avoid him. There was a sickening thud, a sharp, cracking sound that was horribly distinct even over the thunder of the stampede, and then a scream of pure, unadulterated agony. The herd passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a swirling cloud of dust and a terrible, ringing silence. Samuel lay crumpled on the ground, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his leg bent grotesquely beneath him. Jedediah's calm, controlled demeanor finally, completely, cracked. He leaped from the wagon before it had even stopped moving. The memory of his son's death, the ghost of his own helplessness, came roaring back, a tidal wave of remembered pain and fury. He ran to Samuel's side, his face a landscape of torment. He saw the boy's white, pain-filled face, the bone of his leg protruding from the torn fabric of his trousers, and for a second, he saw Ben, feverish and dying in his bed. He scooped the screaming boy into his arms as gently as he could. "I have got you, son," he choked out, the word son, a shard of glass in his throat. He carried him back toward the cabin, his long strides desperate and urgent. Elara, her mind numb with shock, herded the two weeping girls and followed. Inside the cabin, Jedediah laid Samuel on the bed. The boy's screams had subsided into ragged, pain-filled sobs. They had to set the bone, now. A desperate, focused energy took hold of them. They were no longer a man and a woman, but a single unit, bound by the terrible urgency of the moment. "Tear a sheet into strips," Jedediah commanded, his voice rough but steady. "And get the whiskey." While Elara ripped the fabric with shaking hands, Jedediah found 2 sturdy pieces of wood from his kindling box to use as a splint. He knelt beside the bed. "Samuel," he said, his voice softer than Elara had ever heard it. "This is going to hurt more than anything you have ever felt, but it has to be done. You have to be brave for me. Can you do that?" Samuel, his face slick with tears and sweat, nodded weakly. Jedediah poured a little of the whiskey onto a rag to clean the wound, and then poured a larger amount into a cup for the boy to drink. He looked at Elara, his eyes dark with a shared dread. "Hold his shoulders," he said. "Hold him steady." Elara did as she was told, her own tears blurring her vision. She held her son, murmuring words of comfort, her heart breaking with every pained gasp he took. Then, with a deep breath, Jedediah took hold of the boy's leg, one hand above the break, one below. He pulled, a single, swift, powerful motion. The bone slid back into place with a horrifying, grinding click. Samuel let out a single, piercing scream that seemed to tear the very air in the cabin, and then mercifully passed out. Working with a desperate, synchronized focus, they cleaned the wound, splinted the leg, and wrapped it tightly with the strips of sheet. When they were finished, they stood back, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The only sound in the cabin was Samuel's shallow, sleeping breaths and the quiet, terrified sobs of Clara and Lily, huddled together in a corner. That night, the dam of their restraint finally broke. After Alara had settled the girls and sat for an hour by Samuel's side, making sure his sleep was peaceful, she walked to the hearth where Jedediah sat staring into the flames, his face etched with a pain that went far beyond the day's events. The cabin was filled with an atmosphere thick with exhaustion, fury, and a grief so profound it felt like a living presence. She sat on the floor near him, pulling her knees to her chest. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, a single, shuddering sob escaped her, and then another. The terror she had held back all day, the fear for her son, the humiliation in the town, the chilling threat from Blackwood. It all came pouring out. The tears she had refused to shed for her own plight now flowed freely for her child. She began to weep, deep, racking sobs of a soul pushed beyond its limit. Jedediah turned and, without a word, he reached for her. He pulled her into his arms, holding her against his solid chest. She buried her face in his shirt, her small frame shaking with the force of her grief. He held her, his large hand stroking her hair, his own body rigid with a storm of emotions. He was comforting her, but he was also seeking comfort, a port in the tempest of his own roaring memories. The embrace, meant only as a gesture of solace, began to change. The shared comfort dissolved into something else, something raw and desperate. The physical closeness, the scent of her hair, the warmth of her body against his, ignited the unspoken desire that had been simmering between them for months. In their shared pain and terror, they sought an affirmation of life, a desperate anchor in a world that was trying to tear them apart. He pulled back just enough to look at her face, tear-streaked and vulnerable in the firelight. She looked up at him, her eyes dark and questioning, and then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss born of desperation and fury, of shared hardship and unspoken feelings. It was raw, hungry, and passionate, a culmination of everything they had survived together. It was the taste of salt from her tears and the scent of wood smoke from his clothes. It was the breaking of a dam, a torrent of emotion that could no longer be contained. It was a silent, desperate declaration in the face of death and despair. We are alive, we are together, and we will not be broken. The morning after felt like the first day of a new world. The kiss had not been spoken of, but it lived in the space between them, a tangible presence that had altered the very air in the cabin. The raw, desperate passion of that night had settled into a quiet, profound intimacy. The unspoken desire that had hummed with a tense energy was now a steady, acknowledged warmth. They were no longer just two survivors sharing a roof. They were a unit, a partnership forged in tragedy and sealed in a moment of fierce, clinging hope. Their love, though still unnamed, was in the way his eyes would find hers across the room, in the gentle way she would place a cup of coffee by his hand in the morning, in the shared, silent understanding that they belonged to each other now. This new reality brought with it a sharpened sense of the danger that surrounded them. Jedediah looked at Alara, at the three children who now looked to him as a father, and he knew with a cold, hard certainty that defending their home was no longer enough. Blackwood was a cancer, a creeping rot that would not stop until it had destroyed everything he held dear. The time for passive endurance was over. It was time to prepare for war. His days took on a new, grim purpose. He began to fortify the homestead, his movements economical and precise. He replaced the simple leather hinges on the cabin door with heavy iron ones he forged himself in his small smithy. He fashioned a thick wooden bar that slid into 2 solid iron brackets, strong enough to withstand a battering ram. He crafted heavy wooden shutters for the 2 small windows, reinforcing them with strips of metal. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. He was turning it into a fortress. His most important preparation, however, did not involve wood or iron. It involved Ilara. One morning, he took his heavy Winchester rifle down from the wall. He brought it to her where she sat mending a tear in Samuel's shirt. She looked up, her eyes questioning. "You need to learn how to use this," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. She looked from the rifle to his face, a flicker of fear in her eyes. "I have never held a gun before." "I will teach you," he said. He did not treat her as a fragile woman to be shielded from the ugliness of the world. He treated her as a partner, a soldier in the fight for their survival. He saw her strength, her resilience, and he knew he needed it, that they needed it. The lessons began that day. He took her to a small, secluded clearing a short walk from the cabin. He started with the basics, showing her how to hold the rifle, how to check the chamber, how to load the cartridges one by one into the magazine. His instructions were clear, patient, and methodical. He made her practice shouldering the weapon until the movement was smooth, until the cold, hard weight of it felt like an extension of her own body. When it was time for her to shoot, he stood behind her. Her small frame was tense, rigid with a mixture of fear and determination. He put his hands over hers, guiding her grip. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low and close to her ear. "Do not fight it. Let it become a part of you." His body was a solid wall behind her, his large frame shielding hers. She could feel the warmth of his chest against her back, the steady, calm rhythm of his breathing. The necessary intimacy of the instruction was a strange counterpoint to the deadly purpose of the lesson. "Squeeze the trigger," he said. "Do not pull it." The first shot was a deafening explosion that made her flinch, the recoil a hard, surprising kick against her shoulder. The bullet went wide, kicking up dirt far from the tin can he had set on a stump. But she did not drop the rifle. She took a breath, her jaw set, and looked back at him. He gave a slight, approving nod. Over the next few days, they practiced until her hands were steady, until her flinch was gone, until she could reload smoothly and hit the can 9 times out of 10. She was no longer a helpless victim. She was a defender. Despite the grim preparations and the looming threat that hung over them like a constant, low-hanging cloud, they carved out moments of profound and simple joy. These moments were glimmers of hope in the gathering darkness, a fierce, defiant celebration of the family they were becoming. They were a reminder of what they were fighting for. One sun-drenched afternoon, Jedediah led them on a long walk to a hidden creek he knew of, a place where the water ran clear and deep over smooth, gray stones. He had fashioned crude fishing poles for Samuel and Clara from willow branches and twine. He showed them how to bait their hooks and cast their lines. And when Clara let out a squeal of delight as she pulled a small, flashing trout from the water, the sound of her pure, unadulterated joy echoed in the quiet canyon. Jedediah watched her, and a real, genuine smile touched his lips, a rare sight that made Ilara's heart ache with a tender, protective love. They cooked the fish over a small fire, and for a few precious hours, they were just a family, their laughter mixing with the sound of the running water, the threat of Silas Blackwood, a distant, forgotten dream. In the quiet evenings, after the children were asleep, Jedediah would often sit by the fire and carve. He had a gift for it. His large, rough hands could coax the most delicate shapes from a simple block of wood. One night, Ilara saw that he was carving a small, perfect horse for Lily. The next night, it was a deer, and the night after that, a bear. He was carving a whole family of wooden animals, each one imbued with a life and personality all its own. He was creating a world for her, a small, safe kingdom of wood and imagination. One evening, as Samuel was drifting off to sleep, his broken leg now healing cleanly in its splint. He asked his mother to sing. Ilara, hesitant at first, began to sing an old lullaby her own mother had sung to her, a simple, haunting melody about a lost star finding its way home. Her voice was soft, untrained, but filled with a deep, maternal love. As she sang, she glanced over at Jedediah, who sat in the shadows, sharpening a knife. She saw that he had stopped his work. His head was bowed, and in the flickering firelight, she saw the unmistakable glint of tears tracking silently down his weathered cheeks and into his beard. The song had breached the walls of his carefully guarded heart, touching the deep, unhealed wound of his own lost family. He was not ashamed of his tears. He simply let them fall, a silent, shared grief that bound him and Ilara together more tightly than any words could have. But the world outside their small canyon continued to turn, and Silas Blackwood was not a man to be ignored. His retaliation for their defiance in town was not swift and violent, but slow and suffocating. He began to tighten his grip, determined to starve them out. He used his influence at the regional cattle market in the next county. When Jedediah made the 2-day ride to sell the few calves he had raised, he found himself blacklisted. The buyers, under pressure from Blackwood's associates, refused to make him an offer. They turned their backs on him, leaving him with no way to earn the hard currency he needed for supplies they could not grow or make themselves. It was a crippling blow, cutting off their lifeline to the outside world. Then came the second attack, one that was even more insidious. One morning, Jedediah returned from checking the creek, his face a grim, hard mask. "The water level is dropping," he said. He rode upstream to investigate and returned hours later, his face dark with a cold fury. "It is Blackwood," he said, his voice a low growl. "He has a crew of men upriver. They are building a dam." The threat was existential. The creek was their only source of water. Without it, their garden would wither and die. Their animals would perish. They would not be able to survive. The pressure was becoming unbearable. A slow, deliberate strangulation designed to break their will and force them off the land. It was during this time of escalating pressure that a rider appeared, a welcome and unexpected sight. He was a tall, lean man with a steady gaze and a quiet authority about him. Ilara saw Jedediah greet him not as a stranger, but as an old friend. His name was Elias Thorne. Over a simple dinner, Ilara learned that Elias had once been a United States Marshal, a man who had ridden with Jedediah years ago, before the tragedy that had driven him into solitude. Elias spoke of Jedediah not as a recluse or a wild man, but as one of the most honorable and capable deputies he had ever known. A man who had once saved his life in a firefight with outlaws. He spoke of Jedediah's first wife, Sarah, and his son, Ben, with a gentle, respectful sorrow. Elias's presence brought a piece of Jedediah's past into the light, illuminating the man he had been before grief had hollowed him out. Elias looked at Ilara with kind, discerning eyes. He saw the way she and Jedediah moved around each other, the quiet, unspoken bond between them. He watched the children, who treated Jedediah with a mixture of respect and affection. He saw not the scandalous arrangement the town gossiped about, but the fragile, resilient family they were building. Before he left the next morning, Elias took Jedediah aside. "That man, Blackwood," he said, his voice serious. "He is a snake. I have heard talk of him even in the territorial capital. Be careful, Jedediah. Men like him do not like to be defied." He placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "What you are doing here," he said, nodding toward the cabin, toward the family inside. "It is a good thing. It is the right thing." The validation from an honorable man, a friend from his past, seemed to settle something in Jedediah, hardening his resolve. He was on the right side of justice, even if he stood against the whole world. Blackwood, enraged by their refusal to be broken, finally resorted to a more direct and brutal attack. One moonless night, The family was jolted awake by a frantic barking from the dog, followed by the terrifying, panicked whinnying of the mule and the lowing of the cow from the small barn. Jedediah was out of his bedroll in an instant, pulling on his boots and grabbing his rifle. Then they saw it, a hellish orange glow flickering against the cabin windows, and they smelled it, the sharp, acrid scent of wood smoke and burning hay. "The barn!" Jedediah yelled. He burst out the door, with Alara close behind him. The small barn, which stood a good 50 yards from the cabin, was already engulfed in flames. The fire was roaring, devouring the dry timber and hay with a terrifying hunger, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the night sky. In the demonic light of the flames, Alara caught a fleeting glimpse of a lone rider galloping away into the darkness. Their first, desperate thought was for the animals trapped inside, but the entrance was already a solid wall of fire. There was no getting in. The sounds from within the barn were horrifying. The death cries of trapped animals, a sound that would haunt Alara's nightmares for years. "The roof!" Jedediah shouted, his voice hoarse. A gust of wind was carrying flaming embers toward the dry, wooden shingles of the cabin. They had to save the house. For the next hour, they fought the fire with a desperate, frantic energy. They beat at the small spot fires that erupted on the roof with wet blankets. They formed a bucket brigade from the creek, their movements a blur of grim, exhausting work. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking, but they did not stop. They fought for their home, for their lives, their faces black with soot, their lungs burning. Finally, as the eastern sky began to pale with the first light of dawn, the danger to the cabin passed. They stood, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, and watched the barn collapse in on itself. A final, sighing groan of defeated timbers. They had saved the house, but the barn was gone. Their winter supply of hay, their tools, the mule, the cow, and the new chickens Alara had so carefully tended, all gone. It was a devastating, crippling blow. A calculated act of cruelty designed to ensure they would starve or freeze before the winter was through. They stood before the smoking, skeletal remains, two small, soot-stained figures against the vast, indifferent landscape. The rising sun cast a pale, sickly light on the scene of utter devastation. This was it, the breaking point. Alara looked at the smoldering ruin, at the blackened timbers that looked like the ribs of some great, dead beast, and something inside her finally snapped. A low, wretched sound escaped her lips. "It is my fault," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "All of this, it is because of me." She sank to her knees in the dirt and ash, the fight finally gone out of her. "I brought this on you," she sobbed, her body shaking with a grief and guilt so profound it was a physical weight. "If I had never come here, you would be safe. I have destroyed everything." Jedediah turned and looked down at her, a crumpled, weeping figure in the ashes of their life. His face was a mask of soot and sorrow. He reached down and, with a surprising gentleness, took her by the arms and pulled her to her feet. He held her there, his hands firm on her shoulders. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard before. He put a hand under her chin, forcing her to look up, to meet his gaze. His eyes were burning with a raw, fierce intensity. "You listen to me, Alara. Before you and the children came here, this place was not safe. It was a tomb. I was already dead inside. I was just a ghost, waiting to fade away." His voice grew stronger, filled with a ragged, desperate honesty. He held her face between his large, calloused hands, his thumbs gently wiping the tears and soot from her cheeks. "You did not destroy anything," he said, his voice breaking. "You and Samuel and Clara and Lily, you brought me back to life. You gave me something to fight for. You gave me a reason to breathe again." In that moment of utter devastation, standing in the ruins of their hopes, he finally said the words that had lived unspoken between them for months. I love you, Ilara." The words, spoken in a raw, broken whisper, were the most powerful thing she had ever heard. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her like steel bands, holding her as if he would never let her go. "This land," he said, his voice a fierce, defiant vow against the pale morning sky, "is our home. This is our future. Blackwood can burn it. He can try to starve us, but he will not take it from us. We will fight for it, or we will die on it, together." Jedediah's declaration, spoken into the ash-filled dawn, was not an ending but a beginning. It was a vow that transformed their shared grief into a solemn pact. Standing there, amidst the smoldering ruins of their labor, they made a silent agreement. The time for enduring, for merely surviving, was over. They would no longer wait for Blackwood's next blow to fall. They would stop defending. They would start fighting back. The memory of his friend Elias Thorne's visit was a beacon in Jedediah's mind. Elias had spoken of the territorial capital, of a world of law that existed beyond Blackwood's corrupt little kingdom. Redemption's sheriff was in Blackwood's pocket, as useless as a fox guarding a hen house. But the county seat, a 3-day ride away, was different. A United States Marshal was stationed there, a man named Reed, whom Elias had described as hard but fair. He was their only chance. "I have to go," Jedediah said to Ilara as they stood by the cabin door later that morning. The decision was a heavy, dangerous stone in the pit of his stomach. Ilara's face was pale, her eyes shadowed with the terror of what had happened. But her expression was resolute. She knew he was right. "How long will you be gone?" 6 days, he said. "Maybe 7, if the trail is bad. 3 to get there, 1 to make my case, and 3 to get back. A week, an eternity for her to be left alone, vulnerable." His departure was an agony of unspoken fears. He packed light, a bedroll, some jerky, a canteen of water. He left his primary rifle, the heavy Winchester, with her. He stood before her, his hands on her shoulders, and looked down into her face, memorizing every line, every feature. "You remember everything I taught you," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Bar the door at night. Do not let the children out of your sight. Do not trust anyone." "I remember," she said, her own voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her again that he loved her, that she had become the very center of his world, the beat of his heart. But the words were too large, too sacred for a grim morning filled with the stench of smoke and the threat of death. Instead, he simply bent his head and kissed her, a firm, heartfelt kiss that was both a promise and a prayer. He held her for a long moment, then released her, turned, and swung himself up onto the horse he had managed to save from the fire. He did not look back. If he looked back, he might not be able to leave. Ilara watched him ride away, a lone, determined figure shrinking against the vast, empty landscape, until he was just a speck, and then nothing at all. Her fear was a living thing, a cold knot of dread in her stomach. The homestead, their small sanctuary, suddenly felt vast and exposed. The silence was immense, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the canyon. But beneath the fear was something new, something hard and unyielding that had been forged in the fire. It was resolve. Jedediah had trusted her to be a partner, and she would not fail him. She was no longer just a widow. She was the defender of this home, the guardian of her children, and she would hold the line. It did not take long for word of Jedediah's departure to reach Redemption. A prospector, passing through, mentioned seeing him riding west on the main trail, his horse loaded for a long journey. The news was delivered directly to Silas Blackwood, who received it with a triumphant, cruel smile. The fire had done its work. The recluse had finally been broken. Jedediah had fled, abandoning the widow and her brats to their fate. It was the perfect, final victory. He did not waste any time. He gathered 4 of his most loyal, most brutal men. "It is time to clean up that mess in the canyon," he announced, his voice smooth and authoritative. "The town council has authorized me to take the Miller children into protective custody. Their mother is clearly an unstable and unfit guardian. We will bring them back to Redemption, where they can be cared for properly." His men grinned. They knew what this was about. It was about power. It was about crushing the last spark of defiance in the territory. Ilara saw them coming when they were still more than a mile away. A small, dark knot of riders moving steadily toward the homestead. Her heart leaped into her throat. A frantic, panicked bird. For a single, terrifying moment, she was frozen by the sheer, primal fear of a cornered animal. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. Then, Jedediah's voice echoed in her mind. "You remember everything I taught you." The panic subsided, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She would not be a victim. She would not let this man take her children. "Samuel! Clara!" she called, her voice sharp but controlled. "Inside, now!" The children, seeing the look on her face, scrambled into the cabin without a word of protest. "Get under the big bed," she commanded. "Both of you, and take Lily with you. Stay there, and do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Their eyes were wide with fear, but they nodded. Samuel, his leg now healing enough for him to limp, helped his sisters crawl into the dark space beneath the bed Jedediah had built. Ilara moved with a swift, practiced efficiency that surprised even herself. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut and slid the new iron bar into its brackets. It settled into place with a solid, satisfying thud. She checked the shutters on the windows, ensuring they were secure. Then, she took the Winchester from its place on the wall. The metal was cool and solid in her hands. She walked to the front window, the one next to the door, and peered through a small crack in the shutter. The riders were getting closer. 5 of them. Blackwood was in the lead, his face a mask of arrogant satisfaction. She was no longer the frightened, grieving woman who had been cast out of her home, the woman who had stumbled into this canyon, broken and desperate, was gone. In her place stood a protector, a mother whose love had been honed into a weapon. Blackwood and his men reined in their horses a few dozen yards from the cabin. He dismounted, his boots making a soft crunching sound on the ground. He strode toward the door as if he owned the place, a smug, proprietary air about him. "Ilara Miller," he called out, his voice booming with false authority. "I have an order from the town council. I am here to take custody of your children for their own welfare. Open this door immediately." The only answer was the wind. "Do not be a fool, woman!" Blackwood shouted, his patience already thinning. "Jedediah is gone. He has abandoned you. There is no one left to protect you. Open the door, and this will all be over." Inside, Ilara rested the heavy barrel of the Winchester on the window ledge, her hands surprisingly steady. She took a deep, calming breath, just as Jedediah had taught her. She lined up her shot, not at Blackwood, but at the doorframe, a foot from his head. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion of the rifle was deafening in the enclosed space. Outside, the bullet struck the wood with a violent crack, sending a shower of splinters past Blackwood's face. He yelped and leaped backward, his face a comical mixture of shock and fury. His men, who had been laughing and joking, were suddenly silent, their hands instinctively moving toward their own holstered pistols. They had come expecting to bully a helpless woman, not to face down an armed and determined defender. The standoff was absolute. The silence that followed the gunshot was thick and heavy. Blackwood, his face purple with rage and humiliation, stared at the cabin. He had been challenged, defied by the very woman he had sought to crush. Her defiance had made him look like a fool in front of his own men. "You will regret that, you wretched woman!" he screamed, his voice raw with fury. "You will not see your children again. Men, take the door down!" 2 of his men dismounted, their expressions uneasy. They exchanged a nervous glance. Storming a fortified cabin against a rifle was a dangerous, potentially deadly proposition, but they feared Blackwood more than they feared the widow. They started forward, their shoulders hunched. It was in that tense, terrible moment, as the men were about to rush the door, that a new sound broke the silence. The thunder of hoofbeats, fast and urgent, coming down the canyon from the west. Everyone froze. Blackwood and his men turned, their faces filled with confusion. Ilara, peering through the crack in the shutter, felt her heart stop, then soar with a wild, disbelieving hope. Two riders were approaching at a full gallop. The first was Jedediah, his face a mask of grim, righteous fury. The second was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a silver star pinned to his vest, a man who radiated an aura of cold, unflinching authority. Jedediah and the U.S. Marshal, a man named Frank Reed, reined in their horses, flanking Blackwood's small, nervous group. The balance of power had shifted in an instant. Marshal Reed's eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over the scene, Blackwood's enraged face, his nervous, armed men, and the splintered doorframe of the cabin. He had heard Jedediah's story on the long, hard ride from the county seat, a story of a suspicious stampede, a fraudulent debt, and a campaign of escalating terror against a widow and her children. He was a man who had seen the rot of corruption in many small, isolated towns, and he was already deeply suspicious of Silas Blackwood's absolute reign over redemption. "Silas Blackwood?" the marshal said, his voice as calm and as cold as a tombstone. Blackwood, momentarily stunned, recovered some of his blustering arrogance. "Marshal, this is a local matter. This woman is unstable. We are here on official town business." "It looks to me," Reed interrupted, his gaze locking onto Blackwood, "like you and your men were about to attack the home of a private citizen. That is not official business. That is a crime." The arrogance in Blackwood's face began to evaporate, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. This was not a local sheriff he could buy or intimidate. This was a representative of the United States government. Jedediah dismounted, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He walked to the cabin door. "Ilara," he called out. "It is me. You can open the door." The iron bar slid back, and the door creaked open. Ilara stood there, the Winchester still in her hands, her face pale but her eyes blazing. Jedediah took the rifle from her and pulled her into a brief, hard embrace before turning back to face Blackwood. "Marshal," Jedediah said, his voice steady and clear, "this man, Silas Blackwood, is responsible for the death of Thomas Miller. He orchestrated a stampede to kill him and seize his land." "That is a lie," Blackwood sputtered. "You have no proof." "When you sent your man to burn my barn," Jedediah continued, his voice dropping to a dangerously low level, "he was careless. He dropped something." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, metal object that glinted in the sun. It was a silver spur, ornately carved with the initial B. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, his eyes fixed on one of Blackwood's men, a volatile, twitchy man named Caleb. The man's face went white. He instinctively glanced down at his right boot, where a matching spur was clearly visible. His left boot was bare. The marshal's eyes followed Jedediah's gaze. The net was closing. The climax was as swift and as brutal as a lightning strike. Caleb, the man with the missing spur, panicked. He knew he was implicated not just in the arson, but in the stampede that had killed Thomas Miller. He saw a prison sentence, or worse, a rope, looming before him. With a desperate, wild cry, he drew his revolver. He never had a chance to fire it. In the fraction of a second it took for Caleb to clear his holster. Jedediah's old instincts, the instincts of the capable deputy Elias Thorne had described, took over. He was not a grieving recluse anymore. He was a protector, a husband, a father, defending his family from a direct and deadly threat. His own pistol was in his hand in a movement so fast it was a blur. A single gunshot erupted, a flat, ugly crack that echoed off the canyon walls. Caleb staggered back, a look of stunned surprise on his face. A dark crimson stain blossomed on the front of his shirt. He dropped his pistol in the dust and collapsed, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. When the smoke cleared, a dead, ringing silence fell over the homestead. Blackwood's other men, their faces ashen, raised their hands high in the air. The fight was over. Silas Blackwood stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He was exposed. All of his power, all of his influence, had evaporated in a single, violent moment. He was nothing but a cowardly, murderous tyrant, and the law had finally caught up with him. Marshal Reed dismounted, his pistol now in his hand, his face grim. "Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice ringing with finality. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, arson, and murder." He pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt and, with a satisfying click, locked them around the wrists of the man who had terrorized their lives for so long. The reign of terror was over. The news of Silas Blackwood's arrest and the death of his hired gun fell on the town of Redemption like a boulder dropped into a still, stagnant pond. The ripples of shock and disbelief spread quickly, followed by a wave of churning, uncomfortable turmoil. With Blackwood's iron grip broken, the dark truths of his reign began to surface. Stories long suppressed by fear were now whispered in the general store, of other ranchers pushed out by suspicious misfortunes, of debts mysteriously appearing on the bank's ledgers, of a quiet, pervasive corruption that had poisoned the town from its heart. The townspeople were forced to confront a reflection of themselves they did not like, their pious judgment of Alara, their scornful dismissal of Jedediah, their cowardly complicity in Blackwood's public shaming. It all looked different now, ugly and shameful in the clear, harsh light of the truth. They had been participants, willing or not, in the persecution of an innocent family. The guilt was a bitter taste in their mouths. A few days after Marshal Reed had led Blackwood and his remaining men away in chains, a small, hesitant procession of wagons made its way out of town and into the canyon. It was Reverend Michael, his face uncharacteristically somber, along with Mr. Gable from the general store and a half-dozen other men from the town. They brought with them fresh-cut lumber, nails, tools, and sacks of grain. They pulled up to the homestead, their hats in their hands, their expressions a mixture of shame and apprehension. Jedediah and Alara met them in the yard, near the blackened footprint of the old barn. Jedediah stood tall and watchful, his face unreadable, while Alara stood beside him, her quiet strength a palpable presence. It was Reverend Michael who spoke first, his voice lacking its usual booming self-assurance. "Mr. Jedediah, Mrs. Miller," he began, stumbling over the names that had so recently been objects of his scorn. "We have come to offer our help. What happened here? What was done to you? It was a great wrong. We were blind to it, and we are sorry for the part we played." Mr. Gable stepped forward, his own face flushed with a deep, painful embarrassment. He looked at Alara. "Ma'am, I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. My behavior was unchristian. I would be honored if you would allow us to help you rebuild." Jedediah and Alara exchanged a long look. It would have been easy to turn them away, to hold on to the righteous anger they had every right to feel. But they were not builders of walls. Not anymore. They were builders of a future. They needed a barn. They needed to move forward. "We accept your help," Jedediah said, his voice a low, even rumble that held no malice, but no false warmth either. It was the voice of a man making a practical decision. They accepted the help, but they kept their distance. The townsmen worked with a quiet, determined energy, as if their labor could atone for their past sins. Jedediah directed the work, his knowledge of building far superior to theirs, but he did not engage in idle conversation. Alara provided them with water and a simple midday meal, her manner polite but reserved. A bridge was being built between the homestead and the town, but it was a fragile one, and it would take a long time before it could bear the weight of true trust. In the weeks that followed, they focused on the hard work of rebuilding their lives. Marshall Reed proved to be a true and steadfast friend. Before he returned to the county seat, he worked with them, poring over the county records. He found the original deed to Thomas Miller's farm and the fraudulent loan document Blackwood had used to seize it. With Blackwood's crimes exposed, the documents were declared null and void. The deed to Alara's land was legally restored to her. Then, with the marshal acting as the official witness, they filed another document, one that legally joined Alara's 160 acres with Jedediah's homestead. They were no longer two separate properties, but a single, thriving ranch, its boundaries marked on the map as a testament to their union. But not all scars were as easily healed as the burned patch of ground where the new barn now stood. The violence of that final confrontation had left its mark on Jedediah. In the quiet of the night, he would lie awake, the sharp crack of his own pistol echoing in his memory. The image of Caleb falling in the dust burned behind his eyes. He had killed a man. He had done it to protect his family, and he knew, in the logical part of his mind, that he had no other choice. But the act itself had reawakened a part of him he thought he had buried long ago, the hard, capable man who had lived by the gun. The deputy who had seen too much death and had finally fled from it. He found himself growing quiet again, his movements heavy, a distance creeping back into his eyes. He was struggling with the ghost of the man he used to be, afraid that the violence had stained him, that it would somehow poison the peaceful life he was trying to build. Alara saw the change in him, the shadow that flickered in his eyes. She understood that his wounds were deeper than any bullet could make. One evening, she found him standing on the porch, staring out at the stars, his shoulders slumped with a familiar weight of sorrow. She came and stood beside him, her presence a quiet comfort in the darkness. "It is not the same," she said softly. He did not look at her. "What is not the same?" "The man who fought that day," she said, her voice filled with a gentle certainty. "He is not the same man you ran from all those years ago. I did not know that man, but I know you. I know your heart. Jedediah, you did not fight for the thrill of it, or for blood. You fought for Samuel. You fought for Clara and Lily. You fought for me. You fought for love." She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers lacing through his. "That is not a thing to be ashamed of. It is a thing to be proud of." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes glistening in the starlight. In her gaze, he found not judgment or fear, but an unwavering love and acceptance. She was his anchor, his compass, the one who could lead him back from the darkness of his own past. He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of the truth in her words. They stood there for a long time, the quiet conversation and the shared touch doing more to heal his wounded soul than time ever could. Their bond was deepening, moving beyond the desperate passion born of shared trauma into a profound and peaceful partnership. One clear, crisp autumn afternoon, when the leaves of the cottonwood trees along the creek had turned a brilliant, shimmering gold, Jedediah asked Alara and the children to take a walk with him. He led them away from the cabin, up the gentle slope of a hill that overlooked their entire valley. The air was still and quiet. Near the crest of the hill, under the shade of a lone, ancient cedar tree, were two simple wooden crosses, weathered by years of sun and snow. This was his sacred place, the place he had never shared with anyone. He had come here for years to be alone with his grief. Now, he had brought his new family. He stood before the crosses, his hat in his hands. The children, sensing the solemnity of the moment, were quiet. "I want to tell you about the people who are buried here," he began, his voice a little rough with emotion. He pointed to the larger cross. "This was my wife, Sarah." He looked at the smaller one beside it. "And this was our son, Ben." He told them everything. He did not just share the facts of their deaths, but the beauty of their lives. He spoke of Sarah's laughter, which he said sounded like wind chimes, and the way her eyes would sparkle when she was happy. He told them how she had loved the wildflowers that grew on this very hill in the spring. He told them about Ben, a serious little boy with an adventurous spirit, who loved to fish in the creek and who could ask more questions in a single day than any man could ever hope to answer. He shared his grief openly, without shame or reservation. He spoke of the terrible, powerless feeling of watching them succumb to the fever, of the crushing emptiness that had followed, of the long, lonely years he had spent as a ghost in his own life. The children listened, their faces filled with a solemn, compassionate understanding. Elara listened, her heart aching for the pain he had endured, but also swelling with love for this brave, broken, beautiful man who was finally allowing his oldest wounds to see the light. In the sharing of his story, in the baring of his soul to the family he now loved, he was finally making peace with his past. When he had finished, he turned to Elara, his eyes clear and steady. "For a long time," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought my heart was buried here on this hill with them. I thought that to love again would be to betray their memory." He reached out and took her hands in his. "But I was wrong. Loving you, and Samuel, and Clara, and Lily, it does not diminish what I had with them. It gives it meaning. It is like their love planted a seed in my heart. And you, Elara, you made it grow again." He looked from her face to the faces of the children who stood beside her, their family, whole and complete, on this sacred ground, with his past and his present finally united. He knelt on one knee in the soft grass. "Elara Miller," he said, his voice ringing with a deep, quiet sincerity. "Will you be my wife?" Tears were streaming down Elara's face, but she was smiling, a radiant, beautiful smile that seemed to light up the whole world. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes, Jedediah, yes." Their wedding was not held in the church in Redemption, with its cold pews and judgmental eyes. It was held at their own homestead, in the yard between the new barn and the sturdy cabin, witnessed by the land they had fought for and the sky that had watched over them. The children stood beside them, Samuel tall and proud, Clara holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, and little Lily, serving as the most serious and important witness of all. Marshal Frank Reed, their one true friend, had ridden all the way from the county seat to officiate, his presence a symbol of the justice and peace they had finally found. It was a simple, beautiful ceremony, a celebration not just of a marriage, but of survival, of hope, and of the creation of a family forged in fire and love. The final scene took place a year later. The seasons had turned once more, and the ranch was prosperous. The land, once a symbol of hardship and survival, was now a place of life and abundance. The scars of the past had faded, replaced by the vibrant colors of a flourishing home. Laughter, a sound once foreign to this canyon, now echoed in the clear, sunlit air. Jedediah stood in the center of the newly expanded corral, patiently teaching a now taller, stronger Samuel how to rope a calf. The boy's leg had healed completely, leaving behind only a faint scar and a new, quiet confidence. He swung the rope with a focused determination, a mirror of the man who stood beside him, guiding him, teaching him, loving him. Nearby, in the sprawling garden that was now bursting with corn, squash, and beans, Elara and Clara worked side by side, their hands in the rich, dark earth. They moved with a comfortable, familiar rhythm, weeding and tending to the plants that would feed their family through the coming winter. Clara, no longer a silent, watchful shadow, chattered happily to her mother, her voice as bright and as cheerful as the sunflowers that grew along the fence. In the yard, little Lily, her hair the color of spun gold in the afternoon sun, played with a family of wooden animals Jedediah had carved for her, creating a world of grand adventures in the soft grass. Elara straightened up, wiping a stray strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her hand. And her eyes met Jedediah's across the yard. He smiled at her. A warm, easy smile that reached all the way to his eyes. She returned it and walked toward the cabin's front porch. He met her there, his boots making a soft, solid sound on the wooden planks. He reached for her hand, and their fingers intertwined, a natural, unspoken gesture of people who belonged together. They stood in a comfortable silence, looking out over their land, their children, their life. They shared a long, quiet look, a look that held the memory of every hardship, every tragedy, every desperate prayer, and every glimmer of hope. It held the ghost of a lonely past and the promise of a shared future. It was a look of profound peace, of deep, abiding love, and of a family finally, and truly, home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and share your thoughts in English.